everybody to Food Literacy for All. My name is Kimmy and I'm the Sustainable Food Systems Coordinator. We're happy to have you tonight. So the theme for Food Literacy for All this year is Planted in History, a Food Future Informed by the Past. And we have a great panel for you tonight called The History and Future of Food in Detroit with Dr. Shakara Tyler, Jerry Hebron, Dr. Joe Cialdella, and Gabrielle Knox. Food Literacy for All is co-led by Margot Finn and Shakara Tyler, who will also be helping with the panel this evening. And we'd like to thank everybody who's involved in the course. We have two incredible graduate student instructors, Megan Gross and Nayexi Hernandez. We also have Sammy Maldonado, who is the Food Literacy for All course coordinator, and Chris Taylor, who does all of our amazing technology. So thank you so much to our team. Also, a big thank you to the Sustainable Food Systems Initiative for putting the course on, along with support from the School for Environment and Sustainability, also the Center for the Education of Women Plus, which is CEW Plus, and the CEW Plus Francis and Sydney Lewis Visiting Leaders Fund. So thank you for your support. Ways to engage with the course, we have Twitter or X. Come follow us at SFSI_UM and let us know what you think. We also have poll questions through iClicker for students enrolled in the course. And then, of course, all of our videos of the classes will be uploaded to the SFSI website. All right, and this, oh, here sorry, I don't know if I was going to start playing. All right, so then thank you so much. We have Rose, who is going to be talking about a reading response that she listened to something that Shakara said. So I'm going to let Rose take it away.
Dr. Tyler's talk focused on how Black people have been systemically cut off from land acquisition, and I saw a lot of parallels between Shiloh's event and the way in which Native and Black communities have been driven off and denied ancestral land through policies that are designed to support a food system that reinforces white supremacy. Additionally, the conversation about the Great Migration, which was a period in which many Southern Black communities moved away from their land due to white terrorism, reminds me of similar modern situations in which white colonialism contributes to the loss of land in other marginalized communities across the globe, specifically in Palestine. Those who live in occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank have experienced little settler colonial violence for decades. And the systems that are designed by the Israeli government have removed many Palestinians from their ancestral land and created a hierarchy in which Israeli citizens can encroach upon Palestinian territories.
Thank you, Rose, for your analysis. That was lovely. So I'm really excited to introduce our wonderful panel this evening. Our first panelist is Jerry Ann Hebron. For 20 years, North End Christian Community Development Corporation has serviced the residents and businesses of the historic North End through workforce and youth development projects. Jerry Ann Hebron has led the organization for 19 of those years. Hebron's organization also operates the Oakland Avenue Urban Farm, a nonprofit community-based organization that has planted trees, native plants, rain gardens, and pollinator gardens in the North End. The garden is a source of fresh food, providing over 2,500 pounds of vegetables quarterly to the city. In 2022, she was selected to sit on the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Federal Advisory Committee on Urban Agriculture. Our second panelist is Gabrielle Knox. Gabrielle Knox is a thinker, learning and creating models of mutual aid as functions to ancestral understandings of community, sustainability, and local economies. A builder, farmer, and professional neighbor, living, working, and nurturing relationships across their Detroit neighborhood. Gabrielle is the co-founder of the Joy Project, a living archive of African Atlantic agriculture and foodways. And our last panelist is Dr. Joe Cialdella. Joe Cialdella is an educator and public historian who focuses on urban and environmental history. Currently, he's the assistant director of the experiential learning at U of M's Rackham Graduate School. His book, Motor City Green, A Century of Landscapes and Environmentalism in Detroit, examines a long history of gardening, park building, and creating green spaces in Detroit. He received his PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan. So thank you so much for all of our panelists. We're excited to hear you all. And as we said earlier, tonight's panel will be facilitated by our own Shakara Tyler, who is a powerhouse in and of herself in the Detroit food movement.
Peace, everybody. So glad we're here today with Mama Jerry and Gabrielle and Dr. Joe Cialdella. Okay, waiting for Gabby to come up on the panel screen. Okay, yes, peace, everybody. So we're going to jump right into the panel. I'm so honored that you all could join us for today. So we're going to start with a poll question. So I hope everyone is ready. Which of the following does not include Detroit's historical agricultural development? A, Detroit ribbon farms of the 18th century. B, the Pingree potato patches of the late 19th century. C, Detroit Fifth Garden Program during the Great Depression. D, Farm-A-Lot Program of the late 20th century. And E, the 8-mile Burwood Wall land grants during the 21st century. So remember, this is which of the following does not include Detroit's historical agricultural development. And some of this information was in the webinar that you all watched. And then some of it wasn't. So take your wildest guess. So the correct answer is E. I'm not sure what the results are, but the correct answer is E. The 8-mile Burwood Wall was not included as, or is not a valid historical agricultural part of Detroit.
I'm sorry, I'll tell you what they answered real quick. I thought I was being able to show them. So 6 people or 4% answered A, 48 people or 28% answered B, 20 people or 12% answered C. The plurality, 36% did get the right answer, 62 answered E. So some, but it was a real mix across that. All right, I'll go away.
Yeah, and I know it was a tricky question. And so we wanted to start off with this poll because the theme of food literacy for all this year is looking to the past to inform the future. And we want to be clear on what has happened throughout history, specifically as it relates to Detroit agriculture. So now we're gonna start with our first question to the panelists. I hope everyone is ready. So anyone can go first. What are your connections to food and farming work in Detroit? Mama Jerry, or Gabby, or Dr. Joe?
I'll go.
Okay,
I'll
thanks,
go.
Gabby.
How you doing, Shakira? My connections to food and farming work in Detroit. It started for me. I began farming in 2011, and it came from a place of wanting to source a different lifestyle for myself. I was going to Wayne State for a philosophy degree, and gardening seemed like a transition from working at a hospital and doing some of the things that my life path was sending me down. Gardening seemed like a space where I could enter that and at the very least begin to sustain myself in and outside of capitalism.
Peace, everybody. Hey, Gabby, Mama Shakira, Dr. Joe, and students and community. I'm from Lebanon, Tennessee, so I have a long history of family that were sharecroppers and legacy farmers, and my family was part of the Great Migration coming to Detroit, moving to Black Bottom. And so with that, we brought many of our customs, and one of our family custom was grow your own food. And that's what everyone did. We grew our own food. And I kind of I did grow up with that. I mean, fast food, I think about it, I was like over 20 something years old before I had a McDonald's burger, right? So bringing that legacy with me that's ingrained to the work was all about connecting people in our community back to what is meaningful for them and for their lifestyles, helping them learn to grow their own food, but also connect back to their roots. And so that's sort of my mission. It's my connection. It's in everything that I do. And I have so many memories of each one of my family members, from my grandparents, my uncles, my own dad, my cousins, in the garden. So.
Hi, everyone. I guess I'd say my connection is maybe a little bit different from the other panelists, but I was really kind of excited by the work happening in Detroit around urban gardening around the time I was starting grad school, and really wanted to kind of understand the history and kind of cultural practices and meaning that urban gardening had in Detroit as an urban place. So I really started looking at, historic documents and things that kind of recalled some of the history of park building and gardening in Detroit, because it seemed like an exciting precedent to the work to reimagine the city that was happening on the ground today. So my connection is really wanting to understand that history, both the challenging parts of it and the more imaginative parts of it that have kind of informed the urban gardening movement today, and some of the ways that Jerry and Gabrielle were kind of discussing their kind of connections to communities and history in Detroit that led them to the work that they're doing. So, yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Well, yeah, we have a really dynamic team here. I'm excited for this discussion. And I work very closely with Mama Jerry and Gabby on the ground here in Detroit. And so this is such an honor to be here with y'all. So in terms of Detroit being a powerhouse, right, of urban ag, Detroit is like the poster child of an international poster child of urban agriculture. Detroit is also a really unique space as a city as a metropolitan area that has a significant amount of vacant land, and a mass exodus of people, and a lot of other circumstances that has positioned Detroit to be the agricultural powerhouse that it is. And so if you could talk a little bit about your viewpoint of Detroit being this significant powerhouse as the international poster child of urban ag, like on the global level, what does that mean to you and your work?
Wow, that is such a great question, Shakara, because it's almost like a two-edged sword right now, if you will. I mean, yeah, our numbers are great. We've been the leader in this food justice movement for 2-3 decades. And it has, so I lived in Detroit when there were 2 million people, right? Yeah, we got 600,000 now. So of course, just the vacancy percentage of land that we have is mind-boggling. As I walk through neighborhoods and like the neighborhood that I live in and work in now, there was a house on every lot, families, businesses. And so the food justice movement within the last 20 years was, increasing access to food, but also sustaining our neighborhoods, taking our neighborhood backs and sustaining them and rebuilding our neighborhoods so that our neighborhoods are safe and, and people can live here and our children can feel safe here and have access to food, right? And have a sense of community and a sense of belonging. And so that's really what this work has been about for many of us. And if you look at our communities around Detroit, Highland Park, and Hamtramck, there have been significant changes in the way that these communities look and feel. What I see now happening, as I sit on the USDA Innovative Productive Producer Committee and the Farm Service State Committee, and then even the work that we're doing with our local government here, there's some drama happening, and it's happening on the policy side that many of us in this work of this food justice work, we need to refocus and pay attention and get more involved in terms of this policy stuff that's going on that is working to kind of change and control the way that we do this work. So, yes, we're the leaders globally. People are looking at us. They're talking about us. I'm being asked, this is a year that I'm being asked to travel around the country and talk about our work. But at the same time, we need to be working on the policy side.
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah, please jump in, Joe. That's dead on, Mama Jerry. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, that's great. I guess I'd add, I really think to Jerry's points, like it really is the people that have made kind of urban agriculture in Detroit the powerhouse that it is, and the communities. Even going back historically, like to some moments when it maybe wasn't quite as prominent in the city, but there were organizations like the Detroit Urban League doing gardening projects in the city and bringing together African American communities around gardening during the Great Migration. So I really think it has been, even in that historic legacy of urban farming in Detroit, the people and the desire to create and imagine a better city and better world, even when there were more people there, has really kind of been what's led Detroit to have such a prominent place in terms of urban agriculture and urban gardening notoriety today. Obviously, also just the scale of the decline, which Shakara, you were pointing to in the question itself, like just the availability of land and yeah, trying to give people access to it. I think for urban farming has really made Detroit a really prominent place, and why so many different city leaders from Coleman Young to Hazen Pingree, well before, like, have thought of Detroit as a place where urban farming can take root to both support people and also, I think, to some of the more recent urban gardening, really imagine different kinds of futures. And I think that connection to activism in the city and social movements has really been important to sustaining it in recent years, especially the past couple of decades.
Yeah, just to add a little bit more of what it feels like to be that powerhouse and to go into spaces like the National Urban Growers Conference or Bugs or some of these spaces where we gather together. And it is really like Mama Jerry said, in terms of it both being at that cusp means it's a lot of responsibility as much as it is a lot of groundbreaking success and triumphs. But that responsibility is heavy going into Philadelphia or going into these cities that in some ways see themselves mirroring Detroit. Detroit being the city that was a city before there was a city, right? Being the city that eventually these cities throughout our country will see themselves looking like potentially, and looking to us as a strategy of organizing, as a strategy of keeping community together, looking to us in Detroit in some ways as that blueprint. And that's a lot of responsibility to be that powerhouse and to be that epicenter, which, really means that, Mama Shakira here, Jerry here, us working together and us being intentional about working together becomes very pivotal, right? Because you can have 5,000 farms, but if no one's organized, if no one's thinking about policy, and some people are thinking about, hitting it from all angles, right, then it really doesn't mean anything. So it is just as much of a task for more work in the future as it is something that we can be proud of in the right now.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. And just to add, if I could, to that, we are very proud to have our first director of urban agriculture uh, appointed, coming out of the work that we have done with Mama Shakira and Gabby and the Black Farmer Land Fund and D-Town Farm and Keep Growing Detroit. I mean, T has been underground for a very long time, right? So now, Director of Urban Ag, so I believe she is the fourth in the country. So that is amazing. And we now also have our first director of farm service. Lord have mercy. Our USDA CED director has been appointed and announced. I saw the announcement today. So that office, that USDA office, will be opening in Detroit. What's significant about that is that we know that this policy work is very important. And so for Detroit, having been the leader in terms of urban ag globally, we now are going to be the leader, I believe, in terms of how policy decisions are made globally as it pertains to urban ag.
Right. And let's dig into those policies. So in terms of campaigns or policy platforms from the local to the state to the national level, what are the key aspects that we need to pay attention to for urban ag in Detroit and beyond in regards to policy advocacy?
I would say, from my perspective, it's still about the land, the acquisition and ownership of land. It is about the money. It is about how we design, how the programs are designed to support, the farming community, not just on the urban side, but just the farming community as a whole, how these dollars are coming into our community. And again, just the overall accessibility to these programs.
Yeah, those things are really important. But Gabby, I feel like yep, please.
Yep. I was just gonna add to that. I know that there are some holes in our collective regenerative system, and a lot of that happens because of current policies and current things that keep us from, in my opinion, having full sustained regenerative systems, right? In my opinion, the animal ordinance, that is policy that's been in the works for 6+ years in different spaces, depending on who you ask, is on its way out. But the restrictions of and the real analyzing of what it means to be in a city, what a city is and how does it work for the people in it. For me, that is policy work to analyze. I think what we are doing and what urban agriculture asks is for us to create a new definition of what it means to be in a city. And that for me means, what does it mean to have animals and to have animal husbandry? What does it mean to have multiple operating compost systems, or even a city managed compost system beyond recycling that's actually set up to, like Ms. Jerry said here, create resources for those farmers who are not only creating new local economies, but also contributing to the climate and the environment around them.
Yeah, I'd agree with both of those comments and also add that it was policies, like especially at the federal level around redlining and highway construction, that really led to a lot of the very racist policies that led to a lot of the current challenges in Detroit. So kind of the need for bold policies that are more progressive or radical and imaginative in correcting some of those past policy harms in the ways that Jerry and Gabrielle are talking about, I think are really critically important to thinking about how to imagine a different kind of city. And that's why I think the policy piece is really important to the community building and kind of aspects of urban gardening that are so important. But to kind of take it to the next level, kind of those policy areas are really important to addressing the injustices that kind of grew from policies in the past, for sure.
Right, right. And there are certain policies that are getting a lot of heat right now. So, for example, housing justice and the associated policies in urban areas, not just Detroit, but urban areas generally, is getting a lot of attention, right? And so I'm curious, where do you see land justice, food justice, housing justice, and just many kinds of justice frameworks intersecting as it relates to urban agriculture in Detroit and beyond?
Well, when it comes to the housing justice, land justice, you know, some of the work that we do is around community land trust. And so we run the Detroit Cultivator Community Land Trust. And our mission is all about, how do we preserve the land for public control. So we want not public control, community control. We want community to have and be able to make decisions around what this land use, how land use happens within their communities. And same thing with housing. What type of housing needs are just for people within the community? We want our community to make those types of decisions. And we all know that the housing affordability, and it's not just in Detroit, it's all over the country, is through the roof. I mean, it's like we got to go back to square one and figure out what this affordability ratio looks like in terms of real people, real working people, and especially poor people. So, and the only way that we as an organization could figure it out was to take control of it and make sure that we keep and preserve that control into perpetuity for folks in the community. So within the bylaws, it says under community control for 100 years, food production for 100 years, that the board is made up of 30% of people who live here within the community. Those are the voices, making those type of decisions. So I think that's one solution. There may be others that are as good, but that's one. The community land trust, I think, is one that works.
Yeah, that is one solution, but Jerry, I think that is like for me like top tier solution. I would say whenever I talk about urban agriculture or particularly talk about my garden and where it's situated in proximity to my neighborhood and my home and where I live and my neighbors, for me, it is, there's so many intersections, but definitely land justice and housing intersects with this food work that we're doing. The purchase of properties, the ownership, the community ownership, for me and my community has been a act of empowerment, but also an act of protecting our neighborhood. I think that not only for the possibility of us creating a development, us choosing what we want to be on it, but also for the reality that had we not purchased these lots, had we not began to farm, there would be trash on it. There would be, there would be rodents. There would be certain things that I have to live across the street from, that I have to live around the corner from, and so that justice in land work, that justice in us thinking about our neighborhoods, the houses we live in, what we want to see around us, becomes an act of intersection for me, between something that I can hear my neighbors, I can see us not have to do annual alley cleanups as much, because daily we're in this space, daily we're showing presence of people, and it a lot of ways deters people from wanting to at least do it in your face. Um, throw trash on on your land. It is for me, right? Not only that ownership piece, but it also is that empowerment piece. It's that protection piece. It's the safety piece, which anyone living in their house and owning a house in Detroit is looking for. They're looking for safety. They're looking for a neighborhood that they can remember in their childhood, that they can know their neighbors. So facilitating these spaces for me is that intersection in a lot of ways. Again, the almighty answer in some ways is land trust, if done in ethical ways, if managed, and if done with the intention for community to determine what that looks like Jerry said.
I don't know that I have a whole lot to add to that other than I think, yeah, the connection between all of those movements and kind of where they come together, and from my perspective is really around just having an access and a right to nature and the city and in Detroit for those who live there, and equitable access to be able to grow your own food and kind of imagine the kind of city and place that you want to live in. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All those things are on my top tier list as well. So thank you for sharing that um, to all of you, Mom Jerry, Gabby. So I'm also thinking about climate, right? So in addition to community land trust and safety and protection and justice generally, we can't talk about the current world without talking about climate justice and climate mitigation and just the ongoing crisis or the concerns around the warming or the changing climate of the planet, right? And so there's a lot of controversy around urban agriculture and its relation to climate mitigation and climate justice movements in general, right? And actually, there was an article that was recently published by the University of Michigan Urban Sustainability Research Group in the Department of the School for Environment and Sustainability that discusses urban agriculture emitting like 6 times more emissions than conventional agriculture, right? And it's been highly contested. The data is biased, and I mean, there's all kinds of critiques of the narrative that the article pushes, right? And so, of course, within the good spirit of the researchers, they wanted to push forward a narrative that, I guess, revealed some truths around urban agriculture and trying to shed light on the challenges that urban farmers and urban gardeners are encountering in relation to capturing carbon from the atmosphere, returning it to the soil, and all of those processes that we know are true as urban farmers that are doing the work, right? But could you share more from your perspective about the climate justice work that's really illuminated by being a farmer, being a sustainable organic farmer, and doing that work with your heart and soul and not having to rely on other inputs like conventional ag does. Mama Jerry, I think you're muted.
I'm still, thank you. I'm still wrestling with that research. It's like, wow, still trying to wrap my head around this. But when I think about conventional ag, I mean, first of all, it's like I went to seeds. Like these are they use genetically modified seeds, okay? And a lot of that is based on the amount of food that needs to be grown to meet the public demand or the world demand, right? Um, in urban, and I'm like, okay, I get that, but then that's that mass production um, model that is different than the model that we use in the urban settings, at least when we're using sustainable practices to mitigate the soil, to save seeds that are regenerative and uh, that can be uh, re what am I trying to say? Seed saving. It continues that, and each time you replant that seed, it becomes better, it becomes stronger, it becomes more vital to the food, So I think that what we're doing in terms of working to combat stormwater runoff, mitigating our soil, testing our soil to make sure that we're not growing food in toxic soil, that we are feeding people, cleaning our environments like Gabby alluded to, removing the trash, uh, working to minimize rodents and things like this. That's a big win for us, And this thing about the conventional farming is just it. I guess it has a place, but then at some point it becomes very expensive, right? It's detrimental to the land over time, and so the inputs um, it requires more inputs over time in order to regenerate that space. So, like I said, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this, but I just know that the work that we are doing at our farm, where we're, working to make sure that we're planting trees to make the air quality better, mitigating the soil, and saving our seeds, it's good for the people that we're feeding.
Right. And sometimes that's all that matters, right? If our folks are being fed and we are using minimal inputs, we are taking care of the land as we're taking care of ourselves. Like urban ag is not just an ecological process, it's a social process, it's a political process. Most importantly, it's a spiritual process. And so there's a lot that goes into the work that is often invisibilized and ignored. And a lot of research around urban agriculture typically doesn't capture all of those factors, right? And how they relate to one another. Gabby, I know you got something. There you okay.
No, thank you for that piece that you just threw in there. I don't want to go through the whole article and say this point because of this reason, but I will say that I read it both the salacious article with the headlining, 6 times more than conventional, as well as the research itself. And I think that what this what institutions would like you to do oftentimes is to isolate and hyper focus on these particular elements, which takes away from the fact that there is an ecosystem, like you said, Shakira, that there is, I don't just have an arm, I have an arm that's attached to my whole body. And so that perspective and data, as a lot of people on this panel and people outside watching us here know, that you can take data and say a few different things depending on what piece you leave out and what piece you put in, what perspective you look at it. And so I did read it. It did make the assumption that most urban farms don't last at least 10 years. It did make the assumption that most people don't know how to compost correctly. It did make particular assumptions about urban agriculture and these farmers who are professionals in their work, are professionals in their work. It did tend to look at urban agriculture through the lens of a trending, fleeting thing. And for me, someone who spent over 10 years gardening and farming and working at large farms, for profit, nonprofit, all the angles, selling food to people in Corktown that I could do. I know that it's something that I've been doing for a living and something that I do and take seriously. And so for, an article to reflect kind of some of those perspectives of looking at us as people who are have a hobby, people who don't last 10 years, people who have no idea how to compost and we need training, told me a particular thing, right? It told me a particular thing. The survey that they gave to farmers that asked, how important is any of this to you? Very important or not important? When you're talking to urban farmers who are keeping those ancestral practices alive, like Miss Jerry said, we're saving seeds, right? We're thinking about the bees and pollinators. We're thinking about these things, and we're keeping these conversations alive. Conventional farming is not doing that.
Yeah, I think what's so important is like to all the points that have already been raised is like just that urban agriculture and gardening is part of like a larger ecosystem, and what's so important are really like the community resiliency in the face of climate change that comes from it, and just the building, I think, stronger resources within our cities to combat climate change, I think really comes through those community connections that are built through urban gardening, even outside of the agricultural practices themselves. So I think that's a huge piece of how it can be important to helping address the climate crisis in some way. But I agree with everything that the other panelists have said, and I haven't kind of read the recent article other than the headlines around it. But
That's okay, Joe. That was a great response. We appreciate you weighing in on it. So yeah, of course, it's not that urban farmers don't care about carbon emissions, right? Like that's a misnomer. We definitely care, which is why we do what we do. And I really appreciate Mama Jerry and Gabby illustrating how we're doing the work in the most appropriate way that we know how to, even if the carbon emissions are so-called higher than other operations, right? Yes, but the struggle continues so that our narrative is not the dominant oppressive narrative that does us harm reigns. And so
yeah, and I would use it as an opportunity to ask the questions about again, that policy work you were talking about, right? How does that impact 25% of those numbers were in compost. Some of the suggestions that were recommended, how does that policy and the lack of infrastructure increase those carbon emissions, and how much of that is really on the farmer, and how much of that is on those limitations.
Right.
Because there's the amount of data that we have in a comprehensive fashion on urban agriculture is very minimal compared to other kinds of data sets, right? So we have a lot of work to do in terms of not just relying on institutions to collect data for us, but do our own data collection, right? Which the Detroit Black Farmer Land Fund is doing, that Gabby is leading. And so we're blessed to be our own researchers and to produce the knowledge that we know will benefit us so that we can control the narrative. Any other comments on that before we move on? My toddler wants to contribute to the conversation. Okay, so moving on to the next question. History, right? Like we talked a little bit about history, but not a lot about history. So how do you all see the overall history informing the future of food and farming in Detroit? Like we're clear that we have a lot of work to do, but how has the history really informed the present and where are we going in the future?
I always relate it back to my ancestors, you know. I want to say that, you know, historically, and my mother is 92 years old, right? And so my mother she shares a lot with me about, you know, when she was growing up. And so in terms of the history of food and history of farming, my mom tells me and reminds me that when they lived on the farm in Tennessee, everything, they ate everything. Everything had a purpose, right? So their garbage food waste went back into the soil. You know, every part of the animals was used. And there was a certain time to begin planting certain crops. So they did things with a succession plan, which is what we talk about now, succession planning, you know, according to the seasons. I think that as I do the work that I do in community, working with our young people, working with our elders, trying to instill some of these same values and processes and relate food to certain things that we do, the meanings, you know, trying to reduce food waste, you know. This is what our ancestors did. They kind of managed food waste because everything went back into the soil. So I think that just like everything else, with time, you know, we have to reset. And I believe that we are at that time now where we are resetting and rethinking how we relate to food and how we want our children to relate to food and to talk about food. I have a 5-year-old great grandson who will tell you an apple a day keeps the doctor away. You know, he will choose grapes over potato chips. You know, so it's because of what he's being taught and what he's being exposed to. And so generationally, that's what we're doing. We have reset. We're resetting ourselves, and also not only just food, but in terms of how we relate to the land. I also think that I'm sorry, panel, but I'm also looking at our workforce development because we do a lot of workforce development work, you know, at our farm, where we're finding that more and more people are not opposed to working the land. They want to work the land. They want to learn about it. there's some healing that comes with working the land. And we're finding that, especially with the returning citizens that we work with, there's a healing process out of connecting to the food and connecting to the land.
Yeah, I guess I'd add in terms of like how the history of urban gardening in Detroit can kind of inform the future. It can both be maybe a roadmap or a call to action of sorts, but also there are probably a lot of lessons to learn about how to adapt and change in the future too. So if you look back to something like Pingree's potato patches in the late 19th century, where there were a lot of German and Polish immigrants farming and gardening on plots, they were basically, because they were in dire need of food during the economic recession, like forced into that practice, and like their government aid would be taken away if they didn't kind of farm first. So I think today there are much more like a greater sense of empowerment and community building that comes from urban gardening and family connections like Jerry is talking about, ancestral connections. But I think looking at like some of the city or municipal sponsored urban gardening, there are like, yeah, probably practices that we wouldn't think are like model for urban gardening and agriculture today so much. But I think it's empowering to kind of look back at those moments and think about how we can use them to imagine what Detroit or other cities might look like, with our own kind of culture and practices kind of informing the way that we grow food in the city. In the 70s and 80s, when Coleman Young was mayor and started the Farm a Lot program, like he often harkened back to Pingree as like a model for his program, which ended up being quite a bit bigger, and served obviously African American communities in greater numbers. But kind of that model that he set up was actually very different from Pingree's potato patches, because it was about giving folks access to land to farm. So yeah, I think there are ways that the history kind of supports the current urban gardening movement and gives kind of Detroit that superpower or powerhouse kind of status, because it has this long history. But I think it's important to not let that overshadow the really exciting work that's happening on the ground in ways that it's the present kind of urban agriculture movement is really transformative and growing into something entirely new and different from what really came in the past.
Yeah, I would add, just for me, an immediate thought of the elders, teachers, people in Detroit who have helped to push us into a global conversation about urban ag. I would hope that to be right a part of a generation of people who can carry on that legacy, that can into the future continue to carry on the thoughts and ideas, and add to those, right? Grow them, evolve them in ways that are necessary for the times, but in some ways that is what informs my work, right? That is the inspiration for me being in the space that I am, is learning from Mama Jerry, from learning from Baba Malik, and working in these spaces to see elders bring real things to life, to get us a part of conversations. Another thing that I would hope, in a similar vein of some of the things that Joe mentioned there, is a community of Detroiters, Metro Detroiters, who are really asking where their food comes from, and asking in such a way that that they begin to push real contracts to farmers, begin to push real connections to the food our children are eating in schools, the food our elders are eating in homes, and the food that's being fed through hospitals. that we really begin to, as citizens, right, ask, where is our food coming from? And realize that there are farmers who are have the capacity to push out, 14,000 units of, plus whatever, and have the capacity to potentially grow, if given some of those incentives.
Right. Yeah, I'm loving this conversation and I want to take it in so many directions. I'm so thankful. So we have to pause and do 2 poll questions. So the students that are enrolled for course credit, these are your next clicker questions. So the first one is, in 1910, about 14% of US farmers were Black, going from roughly 19 million acres collectively to about 3 million in less than a century. Approximately 90% of that farmland owned by Black farmers for generations has been lost or stolen. Today, Black landowners make up less than 1% of farmland ownership across the country. So what is the estimated worth of the total acreage Black farmers have collectively lost over the 20th century? A, $200 million, B, $326 billion, C, $50,000, or D, more than we could ever count?
Sorry, I thought I unclicked it. So 43% said B. That was the most popular answer. The next most popular answer, 60 said, or 34% said D. And then we have smaller percentages answering A and C. So were they correct? Anybody could take that. Actually, Gabby, do you want to say something about that? I think that was your question, which is a good question.
Yeah. So the question, if you looked up this question or are at all studying the loss of land over the 20th century, you will see the number $326 billion, which is land value. But in this conversation, we have done, I think, a really good job of talking about how everything is connected to itself and each other. There's intersections when you talk about urban farming and you talk about this particular question, which is the acreage and land loss. And it is D for me, more than we could ever count in terms of that ancestral access, that those legacies that go well beyond monetary value. But yeah, kind of a trick question. D is the answer. And B, if you look it up anywhere, that is the number that folks have leaned towards, a number that we can count with what is documented.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we're going to go to the next one. What is the difference between the 1862 Homestead Act that led to the distribution of public lands in the West to white settlers and the land distributed by the Freedmen's Bureau in the South? A, they were similar programs, just in different regions, West versus South. B, Black farmers had to purchase the land while white settlers were given the land for free. C, only the Homestead Act took land from indigenous peoples. Or D, Congress approved the Homestead Act, but the Freedmen's Bureau was under the management of Southern states. So you really got to know your history for this one. This is not for the faint of heart.
All right, and the poll has closed, and you guys did a good job on this one. You mostly got it right. So the plurality, 66% said B, and that is correct.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Margot. So I think we're probably going to go to the audience for some questions, and then we can end with the last poll question that Joe shared with us. So I believe Megan is going to support with Q&A.
I think if you want to just moderate it, that's totally fine. We've put them in the chat for you.
Yeah, that works. Yeah, we have some really rich questions here. So the first one is, when you refer to policy work, who are the main stakeholders that need to be influenced?
So when I refer to policy work, there are layers. So of course, our top layer is the national policymakers, decision makers, the Secretary of Agriculture, USDA. And then we come down to the state, which is Farm Service, Rural, NCRS. These are the state reps, because I've been at the state capitol of Michigan when a policy decision was made about free range chickens. And it just so happened to be one that I was in favor of. But I mean, they make decisions that affect how we do our work. And there's no public notice for you to be there, to say yay or nay, or to talk to your rep before the vote. So definitely our state representatives, and then of course, our city council folks. As Gabby mentioned, here in Detroit right now, we're wrestling with the Animal Husbandry Act, where we did the urban farming ordinance in 2013. And here we are, 2024, and it's still illegal to have chickens in the city. And chickens, that is a protein source. So, yeah.
Thanks for that, Mama Jerry. Gabby or Joe, do you want to chime in?
No, I think that was a perfect question for for Jerry. I think I think that was a perfect question for Jerry. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are, different layers of stakeholders and policymakers that need to be influenced, and probably also something to be said for, connecting with neighbors or trying to get them to support new ideas for policies and policy work happening in the city or even regionally to kind of make urban agriculture more recognizable to folks who maybe don't understand why it's important to make it legal to have chickens in Detroit or other communities. Like doing some of that kind of groundwork organizing too could be important to the larger policy aims for people who are maybe skeptical.
Thanks for contributing, Joe. All right, going on to the next one. Now, this is juicy. In various communities, there has been issues with long-term land access or land ownership, stewardship protections. For example, community members have spent time and resources to remediate and develop initiatives, only to be pushed out of those properties as they become desirable to large developers. What kinds of protections are in place or are being considered?
Oh,
I see.
I mean, this is why I'm such a strong proponent of the community land trust. Yeah. People have to get activated and engaged in their community and buy this land. The community folks need to lock down the land, right? And we've had decades, opportunities. When I'm a former real estate broker. I remember well when you could buy a vacant lot for $1, right? And now it's ridiculous, what they're charging. But and that's what happens. The opportunists, the speculative investors and developers come in and they buy the land, very, very low price, hold on to it and or develop it, sell it to us at an outrageous price, and they move on, right? In the meantime, while they're holding on to the land, They're not cutting the grass. They're not moving the debris. They're not doing any of that. So yeah, community groups, from residents should get together, and the Detroit Land Trust is an amazing tool to use.
Yeah, I think that
I
that
will
seems
also say the Detroit Black Farmer Land Fund. um, we came together, what, 4 years ago, because we saw farmers, producers working the land, mediating the land, growing food, taking care of their community, and then, but they didn't have the money to buy the land, right? They couldn't buy it. Either the city or the land bank would not sell it, or there just was no money. And then someone would come and buy it from under them, or they would get displaced and have to move and do this again. We know growers that this happened to 3 or 4 times, right? So we came together as a collective and said enough. And so we took action, raised money, and then became the mediator to buy the land for producers for the purpose of growing food, which made them land secure. So you have to get creative with the initiatives.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And part of the reason that looking at Detroit or other cities, that urban agriculture hasn't been able to be a sustained presence over time is because the folks who need to do the farming, who want to do the farming, don't have access to the land or don't own the land. So that's really obviously a key important piece to sustaining it over time, you know. Pingree wanted to, you know, create agricultural parks in Detroit, but even at that time, like, couldn't get city council or others to agree to like dedicate the land to that purpose. So I think it speaks to what a lot of the other panelists have been talking about around like reimagining what a city should be and how it operates in terms of community land trusts or other mechanisms to make sure people have access to the land and can create the kind of city that they want to live in and that can sustain them and support them.
Yeah. I would add, just to highlight again, the Detroit Black Farmer Land Fund, and the work, how much being in community with folks who are willing to share knowledge with each other. Something I think that is really beautiful is this year, the Detroit Black Farmer Land Fund is working with people who have went through the process already to be land stewards and to help others through that acquisition process. So you're working directly with people who are also farmers, who are also living in a city with you, and have just themselves gone through that land acquisition process that oftentimes is attached to a compliance period. And so there is things I can acknowledge in that relationship to land acquisition, which is the answer, right? Is that ownership, that community ownership, that still prevent people. There is still hoops, there is still an extensive process, there is still a long compliance period. There is still the requirement to change the zoning of your property. And so these become pieces that being people in community, we have to make sure we're teaching each other, right? Making sure other people know that you got to send your updates, that you have to go through this process, that you got to contact BSeed and get an inspection, and all of the different hoops that are made that people have to jump through in order to get to the point where they actually outright own their land with no interest of the Detroit Land Bank Authority and no interest of or threat of losing that land back to the city even.
Right. Yeah. All of that. Right. All of that we need to be sharing out, right? Community land trusts and also conservation easements, which have typically been applied in rural areas. But urban conservation easements have been making a lot of traction as a way to ensure the land can remain in agricultural production and land and owned by the people, hopefully within a communal ownership framework, right, in perpetuity, right? Because we are up against a monstrous system that cares nothing about the people and the land itself, right? It's all about the profits. And so the community land trust and urban conservation easements has been really fruitful tools to fight that system, and even in eminent domain situations, right? So yeah, there's a lot of storytelling that we can get into on that at another time as well. So there's another question about how does the city of Detroit grapple with urban agriculture potentially serving as a green gentrification, which could eventually displace Detroit homeowners? This is really similar to the previous one, but if you want to go deeper within this narrative, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the other panelists have kind of answered it, but I think policies that would protect against that are obviously really, really key to making sure that urban agriculture isn't the cause of green gentrification or things like that, and land becoming inaccessible to those who've been in the city for a long time and want to use it for farming. But yeah, it can be a double-edged sword, obviously, because it is making, for those who live there, the city more desirable and sustaining them and giving the city and their communities life. And so that's a good thing, but having protections so that it stays in the hands of the community, I think, is what's obviously most important, as the other panelists have already pointed to.
That's exactly what happened with our work at our farm, Oakland Ave. All of a sudden, it became desirable to live around the farm. It was safe, and someone pointed out to me one day. They said, "You're the reason for this gentrification." It was like, "Oh, okay, so got to rethink this." And so that's when we started exploring community land trust.
And what's the name of the land trust? Do you want to share it?
Detroit Cultivator Community Land Trust, and it's actually the first in the city of Detroit. And we've been working with the Ross School of Business from U of M and Detroit Justice Center. So it's great, but it took 5 years.
Yeah, developing land trust is definitely a marathon and not a sprint. I've heard a lot of people say it takes a really long time, but thank you for doing that work, which the entire Detroit urban ag community is benefiting from, Jerry. All right, so we have another question here. My family is from what is called Mexican Town in Detroit, and my grandparents did urban farming in Detroit years ago before it was considered urban farming. It was just growing food, and I currently still have family in Detroit. So this is near and dear to my heart. Can you tell us how we can get involved in helping to keep the momentum going?
So my question would be, one, do you own the land? And hopefully you do. And being that it's Detroit, make sure that you are following all of the requirements in terms of land use, zoning, because that's going to be very, very important when it comes on the policy side. So make sure that you get that done. And you want to engage people in your community. You want to talk to people. You want to get them involved in what's going on. That garden space, green space, is a great space for bringing people together intergenerationally. It doesn't have to always be about growing food. It could be growing food and other activities, for the kids and for the elders and things like that. But you want to get that special land use zoning permit in place.
I think I may have not heard the question fully, but to keep the momentum going in this global conversation and this local movement is I think what I interpreted. I would say I think I might have said it earlier, but you know, farming, urban farming, this is as you said in your question, something that is ancestral, right? People were just farming, right? People just had some collard greens in their backyard. In this city, especially moving in the migration, moving and with these cultural norms, as Jerry said earlier, they brought those traditions with them. And so, yes, it was just farming, and now it's urban agriculture. Now it is something to be studied and talked about in a way that even the USDA has to look at us, right? Has to say that this is a classification of farming. And I think that goes back to my comment of asking where your food comes from. I think that's what everyone can do to keep the momentum going, is to be in these spaces, really thinking for yourself where this food comes from, thinking logistically how far it takes to get to you, thinking about what's the closest garden. Can I, you know, is it accessible for me to get there? How can I get there? How can I support them? And using that as one of many strategies towards supporting this movement, is figuring out how you personally can make little small changes to support local versus conventional farming, and being in these spaces, block club meetings, school board meetings, whatever meetings, and asking where is our food coming from, and how can we make a change that speaks to wanting to support a sustainable local food system.
Yeah, I think amplifying the work that's already happening on the ground and trying to build, positive relationships with those around you to kind of see where your skills or experience can benefit the work that's already happening on the ground, I think is also important.
Yes, I agree. I agree. And I'll take the opportunity to add one quick nugget. I think having a political analysis is important as well, because Detroit is majority Black, and we can't talk about Detroit without talking about racial apartheid. I mean, Detroit is one of the most segregated cities in the country. And so having a political analysis around race and capitalism and colonialism generally is really important when you want to come to the city and support the work and push the work forward in whatever respects that looks like. So we're going to go to the last poll question. Please get out your clickers for those that are enrolled for credit. All right, in 1894, approximately how many acres of land in Detroit did Polish and German immigrant farmers cultivate according to the city's agricultural committee? A, 30, B, 130, C, 230, and D, 430.
All right. The plurality here guessed, well, I'm going to say it's a guess because they're wrong. C. So a lot was C. Joe, did you want to actually say anything more about this question? Because this was one that you sent us. I mean, I think people are surprised by 430, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the reason I chose it because it is kind of, even to me, when I first learned it, pretty surprising. So I think just points to kind of the longer history of urban farming in Detroit, and the fact that this kind of land use has been a really important part of the city's history, especially for marginalized communities that, yeah, maybe we're just on the margins of history and the city's past. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Thanks for this panel. It was really wonderful, as some of the comments in the chat have said as well. I have some boring announcements that I have. Well, the first one isn't too boring, I hope. Following up from last week's panel of labor organizers, I was surprised actually today to see this come through social media. Apparently, there's been an effort to unionize at the Sweetwater's cafes in Ann Arbor, rather. There's 4 of them. I actually sent an email to Lisa B as this call to action requested. You can read it, and I'll post it on Canvas too. I know it's kind of a lot to try and read all at once. I also emailed a barista who I have, somebody who I know who works as a barista at Sweetwater's, and I got a reply from the CEO and also from the barista. So just a little bit of what each of them said. The current barista said, quote, "We've realized that unfortunately they seem to have unlimited resources and no qualms about acting unethically. So our only tool against them is showing them how this could hurt their reputation and already is." End quote. And the CEO, Lisa B, emailed me back saying, quote, "I'm sorry that you feel so inspired to cancel a local business without ever asking all those involved, including the many staff who have experienced this process from start to now and do not want to be represented by the Teamsters, but are fearful to speak up due to many reasons, including reactions like yours and others." I had said that I was in support of them respecting the union vote. Anyhow, something for you to consider. Again, I'll put this call to action on our Canvas site so you can read it and consider whether or not you would also like to email Lisa B. That's it. Let me tell you a little bit about what's coming next week. Next week, we're going to hear from Helen Zoe Veit, who's a professor over at Michigan State University, just down the road. She's got a forthcoming book that I'm so excited about called, it used to be I liked her former title. The new one is good too, but the former title is Picky, and the new title is Small Appetites, A History of Children's Food Culture. And pickiness is still a big part of it. She's asking, are children naturally picky? Americans talk about children's naturally sensitive taste buds, and children's foods have become a routine part of grocery stores and restaurant menus. But the idea that children and adults have different tastes is actually very new. 100 years ago, being a picky eater didn't exist as a concept, much less as a normal or expected part of children's identities. So she'll tell us more about that book project. And I saw her give a talk a couple of years ago at the Ann Arbor Culinary Historians Society. I forget the exact name, but there's a group of culinary historians that do monthly talks at the library, and she came to talk there, and it was just a fascinating discussion. So that's going to be a lot of fun, and we'll see you next week.